Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to House of Israel International's live worship service.
Since we have so many verses to get through tonight, we're going to go verse by verse, and we'll do some commentary on each of the verses that we go through. And we're going to be making the distinction between Lot and Abram. As you'll see that they will come to a point to where a separation has to take place. And that's where we'll be making that point. In verse 1 of Genesis chapter 13, and Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. Now, you know that Father spoke to Abram while they were in Ur to leave. And in Genesis chapter 12, we see, or we looked at how he spoke to them in Ur. They came up to Haran. Terah, Abram's father, died in Haran. And then Lot, Abram, and Sarah went on down into Canaan. Now, this was the land that Father had told them to go to, because we read in Acts that Father spoke to Abram while they were in the land of Ur of the Chaldean. And so he told him to leave his father's house, his country, and his kindred. And so he gave him specific instructions to leave his father's house, his country, and his kindred. Now, Abraham took his father with him. He took Lot, his kindred, with him, and they went up to Haran. And then Terah died, and they accumulated souls and substance while they were in Haran. And then after Terah died, they came down to Canaan. Now, while they were in Canaan, there was a famine. And we discovered last week that there is no instruction for Abram to go up to Egypt, but he goes up to Egypt. And while they're in Egypt, he had come up with a plot. And as we looked at the data that is revealed in the book, the plot wasn't determined when they went up to Egypt. The plot was determined before they left Ur, because we found out that he and Sarah had conspired that wherever they went, she would say that she was his sister. We also looked last week at what is actually written, because in all of the historical information we have on the genealogy, we note that when a person had other sons and daughters before they died, the genealogy would reveal. Terah, the Bible says, he only had Abram, Haran, and Nahor. And that Haran died, but Haran begot Lot. But he also begot two other daughters. And in the context, it appears that it's possible that Sarah was not Abram's half-sister or the son of his father, but the possibility of being the daughter of his brother. And so we looked at that, and we looked further that Terah did not have any other sons and daughters other than Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So now they go up to Egypt. There's a lie. I don't know how else to say. He just lied. They lied together. And for some strange reason, but I already know what the reason is, I guess, if I was to think about it. The Bible tells us that from Adam to Moses, death reigned. Right? From Adam to Moses, death reigned. And because there was no law that was necessarily in place, sin wasn't necessarily identified because the law identified what sin was. Now, that's not to say that Abraham didn't lie. It's just that there was not necessarily a penalty at the time for lying. There was no instructions concerning lying. And so there was a lot of stuff that was done up until the law where it exposed the things that were being done that was not to the liking of the Almighty. But nevertheless, because of Sarah, and those of you who've gone through our discipleship course, you know that Father established a covenant with Sarah. Now, we don't hear so much about the covenants that Father established with the females in the Bible, because there are a few, but we do hear about the covenants that he established, or people preaching on the covenants that he established with the male, because it is clear that he established a covenant with Sarah. He even establishes a covenant with Hagar, but that's further down the road. Father caused a plague to come upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarah. Now, Abram didn't just lie by himself. Sarah conspired with him, or he conspired with Sarah, because in essence, they both lied. But yet, Father, because of Sarah, caused a plague to come upon Pharaoh and his house. Pharaoh calls Abram and tell him that what he did, you lied to me. Why did you say she was your sister instead of your wife? Now, take your wife and go. Take your wife and go. Now here's the thing is that all of the substance, the wealth that Pharaoh bestowed upon Abram for Sarah, he had every right to take it back. But he didn't. He told him to go. And so Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him. So we know that Lot, Abram, all of the substance and the souls he had acquired in Haran, and all of Lot's herdsmen and people, they were all up in Egypt with Abram. Lot followed Abram. Lot was Abram's nephew from Haran and possibly the brother of Sarai, as we mentioned. And Lot went with Abram, but then Abram took Lot. So there is this language where did Lot go or did Abram take? Now, when they left from Haran, the Bible says Abram took him. Verse 12 or verse 5, Genesis 12. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. Now, we suggested last week that the fact that Abram did not fully obey, he obeyed, but he kind of pushed the envelope, if you would, because he did take his father, and he did take his kindred, a Lot, that now they're facing a famine in Canaan that we don't know if that famine would have occurred had he gone when he was told and did not take his father with him and spend that time in Haran. We don't know. We won't know. But in verse 2 of chapter 13, we see Abram now was very rich. He was rich in cattle, he was rich in silver, and he was rich in gold. Now, Abram had substance in souls when he left Haran, but Abram was very rich with cattle, silver, and gold when he left Egypt. And Pharaoh gave Abram much for Sarai's sake, We found that out in Genesis 12, verse 16. And Pharaoh here, he entreated Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen and he asses and men servants and maid servants and she asses and camels. So Abram had a lot of stuff, but he also had silver and he also had gold. And he went on his journey from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai. Now, we noted that Hai and Ai, which we'll read about in Joshua, is the same place. It's just for some reason, and what I see sometimes is hard to prove some of these things, but Moses is writing, and Moses used the term Hai more than once in his writing in the Torah, the 5 books. But when we read it in Joshua, Joshua used Ai. Joshua uses Ai instead of Hai, which Moses used. Now, they both spoke the same language. But what I suspect is that when the translators are writing and they're translating, that the language is, at the time, is what they may be using in their translation. Now, we pointed out last week that when Pharaoh and Abram talked, Pharaoh called Abram and had a conversation with Abram, but there was no indication of any translator being in the midst of them. No interpreter, no translator. Now, we read earlier that the language had been confounded and people couldn't communicate with each other. And so Abram from Ur goes up to Haran, and they're having conversation, comes down into Canaan, and they're having conversation, goes further down into Egypt, and they're having conversation, and there's no indication of any translators or interpreters in the mix of this conversation, as if all of them spoke the same language. But we know that not to be true, because Father confounded the language and the people couldn't communicate with each other. So it's only logical or reasonable to think or conclude that the people within certain regions probably communicated with each other, but could not communicate per se with people outside of those regions, unless there were individuals who traveled. Like if I go to a country today, and I've been to several, and if I'm in Russia, I have Russian translators. There are people who in Russia can speak English, but in the mix of the communications in the audience, there are people who don't speak English. In Ukraine, in Georgia, in London, in Israel, in all of the places that I've gone, Kenya, Nigeria, having to have someone who would interpret, because the language of the people, or the people within the audience, although some could speak English, there are others who could not. And so you don't see interpreters in the writings. And because you don't see interpreters in the writings, the mind would assume that they're all communicating and speaking the same language. And if I didn't point it out, you probably wouldn't see it. Now, we know that when we get further on, when Joseph's brothers come up to Egypt, remember there's another famine that we're going to read about as we go further, that Joseph's brothers come up to Egypt and they think Joseph is an Egyptian. And in the conversation, Joseph uses an interpreter. So they're speaking their language. An interpreter is interpreting it to Joseph. Joseph is speaking a language they don't understand. The interpreter is interpreting to them. So we know that there was a difference between the Hebrew and the Egyptian tongue. And so Pharaoh, a Egyptian, Abram, a Chaldean or an Assyrian from Ur, is not speaking the same language. And so Hai and Ai, we see the difference when we go into the Greek from the Hebrew. We read about Noah, Noah, but when we read about Noah in the New Testament, it's Noe. And so we can see the change in the spelling, which is based on the interpretation from translating it from the Greek or the Latin into the English and translating from the Hebrew into the English. So those little things are there, but they're easy to overlook. And I'm pointing these things out because there are some language barriers and there are some spelling differences and some pronunciation differences of people with the same name and places, even as we go through the New Testament. And what I've tried to make clear is that languages are a mixture. Every language is mixed with some other language. We use the illustration. If I come into a country that don't have books, and I bring a book, and I give this book as a gift to the leader, and they say, well, what is this? Why? Because they don't have the terminology for book in their language because there are no such things as books. Well, what I've just done is introduced a new word into the language. So now when they go forward to explain or to say what this is, what are they going to say? Book. They're calling it a book, but they didn't have a word for book until a book came from a foreign place, and now a word has been introduced into that language. And this is how languages have evolved. And it's going to be interesting as you start doing word searches and word studies in the Bible, because in seminary and Bible college and in church, they say everything in the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Well, the fact of the matter is that the Pharaoh didn't speak Hebrew. And so the Pharaoh's words were Egyptian. So how could the Pharaoh's words be Hebrew when he was Egyptian? The translators translated the words into Hebrew. And so we have an Hebrew Old Testament. But the words that we know that are from the Hebrew Old Testament were spoken by non-Hebrew people. And so we just don't want people pulling the wool over our eyes. And there's been a lot of wool pulling. So we're just removing the wool so people can see, and we don't have to be afraid to see the Bible in its purest form if we are true to getting to the root of what is actually written. So why am I looking in the Hebrew to get an understanding of an Egyptian word? It's a translation, folks. And so folks want to learn Hebrew to understand the Hebrew portion of the Bible. And I don't have a problem with that, but you have to understand that languages have gone through evolution. And we have to be true to that, because some of the words, those of us who actually do word studies, some of the words we try to look up and we can't find the origin. We don't know what language this word originated. You see. But I suspect if the Egyptians spoke it, it was probably Egyptian. I suspect if the Canaanites are speaking, it was probably Canaanite. That's just me and my suspicion. Verse 4. Unto the place of the altar. So Abram now leaves Egypt, go up, and he finds his way to the place that he had made an altar and then left to go up to Egypt or up to throughout the land. So he didn't go from there to Egypt. They sojourned or journeyed. And typically what that word means is they went from place to place. And so it came unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first, and there Abram called on the name of YeHoVaH. Now there's two things that we want to point out, well, one particularly, but two times. That Abram built an altar the first time. Now he comes back to the place where he had built the altar, and he called on the name of YeHoVaH. Now, in neither of these instances where he built an altar was there a sacrifice offered on the altar. Now, a person who would look up in the Hebrew the word altar, they would see that the altar was a place where they offered sacrifices. Now, the interesting thing about it was that doesn't necessarily hold true to people who understand temple or tabernacle furnishing. Why? Because in the court where the offerings were offered, there was a brazen altar. But in the holy place, there was another altar, an altar of incense. And there was never a sacrifice offered on this altar. Now, in most dictionaries or Bible dictionaries, they're going to have the altar as a place where sacrifice was offered. But that's not the case with this particular altar, because they burned incense on this altar, and nothing was ever sacrificed on this altar. And the altar that Abram built or made, there is no indication that he offered a sacrifice on the altar. In fact, we're going to see as we go forward, there was two particular situations where Father specifically had him, when he cut these animals and laid them out, and another place where when he takes his son up, where he builds an altar where there's actually going to be a sacrifice, but it wasn't this particular altar, or there is no indication whatsoever that an offering of sacrifice or animal was offered on this altar. It was a place where he marked as a location where the Almighty appeared to him. So when the Almighty appeared to him, it was a marker. And he returned to this place where the Almighty appeared to him, because the idea, and this is where when I teach on how to hear God's voice, that it is important that if there was ever a place that you heard Father speak to you at, there's a good chance that that is a place where he will speak. If you've ever heard his voice and you recognize where you heard his voice, there's a good point, thought that if you don't hear his voice now, that if you go back to the place where you heard his voice once, there's a good possibility you'll hear his voice again. And this is why, for me, it's important for us. When I was in Michigan, I had that place. When I come here, it's like there are places that I can go that I expect him to speak. And the reason why I expect him to speak is because he normally speaks in those places. And what's important to me is that whenever I need to hear from him, and that's a lot, then I will find myself in those places. Meaning I have to get away from the noise. I have to get away from the people. I have to get into a place of quiet. And I'm fortunate that one of the places that he speaks to me, some of you know, and I've said this several times, that I can drive for hours without ever having music on. Because one of the places, Father, is like whenever I get in my truck and start driving, it's like I don't hear the door shut, but it's like I know he's in there with me. And it's not long before he starts talking to me. And I've passed by exits. I've driven miles out of the way because I'm literally sometimes amazed that I have driven the distance I've driven and I've not ran into anything because I'm not even aware sometimes that I'm driving and I've passed where I would normally get off. I've passed it by a few exits or whatever, and I catch myself in this daydream, coming out of this daydream and looking around to see where I'm at, only to find out, well, it's amazing sometimes that I haven't had these situations, these run-ins. Abram returned to the place where YeHoVaH had appeared to him, and there he called on the name of YeHoVaH. During all of this traveling with Abram, Lot continues to prosper to the point where his substance abounds. And so, in verse 5, and Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And this is the first we're hearing about Lot's flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was so great, so that they could not dwell together. Now, before they went up to Egypt, they were dwelling and sojourning and all of that. But now that they've come out of Egypt, they got so much stuff, so much flock, so many herds and tents of individuals that the land is kind of like too small for them all. And so the land, although vast, was unable to sustain all the herds and flock of Abram and Lot. And then there were other inhabitants in the land, like the Canaanite and the Perizzite, as we'll see. In verse 7, and there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle. So who's strifing? The herdmen, the people responsible, the employees are fighting amongst, this group of employees is fighting amongst this group of employees. And just some simple logic would be, to me, it's like, okay, we were at the watering hole first. And so our cattle have enough water here at this water hole, but your cattle come and now there's not enough water. Well, we were in this grazing land first. And now here come their cattle, and pretty soon our cattle are mixing up and I suspect they were branding way back then. It's like, how do you distinguish your cattle from my cattle, your herd or flock from my flock? And so there was this strife. Now, Abram being a man of peace, because he was a peacemaker, and we'll see this as we go forward. And being a peacemaker is something honorable. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall see YeHoVaH. And so Abram was a peacemaker and one to avoid strife. Therefore, he gave Lot first choice to determine what land he wanted. Now, it seems as if Abram is the leader here, he should get first dibs. But what does he do? Abram give Lot first dibs. And we're going to see what Lot does. And Abram said unto Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. Now, what's interesting here is that Abram didn't pull, I'm your uncle card. Abram didn't pull that I'm the senior here. What Abram said is, listen, we're brethren, we're kin, we're brothers, we're equal. This is what he's actually saying in the sense, because now he says, let there be no strife between our herdmen, because we're brethren. Is not the whole land before us? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If you go to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you depart to the right, then I will go to the left. In other words, you have first choice of what you are going to do. Now, this next verse, Lot moved by sight, whereas Abram moved by faith. Abram moved by faith, depending on YeHoVaH to sustain him wherever he went. Because you remember now, the Almighty has already told Abram, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to take you into the land. And so Abram here is sharing the land with Lot. And Lot lifted up his eyes. Now, this is where the sight comes in. Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan. And if you were to do, I got one map, but if you were to just Google things like Jordan, Bethel, Zoar, Sodom, Gomorrah, you'll get the location of where these things are. But Moses put something in here that really we need to just take a moment and look at. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. Before YeHoVaH destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now notice this comparison. Even as the garden of the Lord, he said. So he's bringing Eden into the picture. And Eden had headwaters. I mean, there was water all around Eden. Even like the land of Egypt. Now, they just come back from Egypt. And we're going to see as we go through that when there's famines in other parts of the lands, the people go up to Egypt. There was at least 7 years of famine that hit Egypt. And it just so happened that father had gave a boy a dream that he shares with his daddy, his mama, and all his brethren. And he ends up a slave in Egypt. That father gives the insight to the only famine that we really read about in Genesis, of 7 years of famine. And during the 7 years of famine, people still went up to Egypt for survival. Moses compared the land Lot chose with the land of Eden, the garden of YeHoVaH, and like Egypt, as thou comest to Zoar. Now, if we were to look at a map, and I could have put something, but I'm going to just try to give you an illustration. Those of you know, the land of Egypt, the Mediterranean is to the west, and then it comes down. Jordan to the east comes down, Egypt at the bottom. So you got the north of Israel, and you've got the south of Israel. And the south of Israel is Egypt. Now, the Jordan runs down toward Egypt into the Dead Sea. And so the Dead Sea is the lowest part. But there is also waters that run into the Dead Sea from the south, from Egypt. And so you've got all of this water running toward the Dead Sea, and then right at the tip end of the Dead Sea, you got Sodom, Gomorrah, and Zoar. So Zoar and then Egypt. So coming up from Egypt with all of the water, the Nile, and then all of these headwaters that are coming down into, you could say up, but because of the level, the sea level is coming down into the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place. And so it's well watered. And if you were to look at it on the map, you can see that from what Lot saw, it's like, man, we should be able to thrive, not just survive with all the greenery, the grass. There's plenty. But Moses inserted there before YeHoVaH destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Sodom, if we were to look again in the Dead Sea, Sodom, Gomorrah, Zoar. And so, no, Gomorrah, Sodom, Zoar. Because Lot's going to pitch his tent toward Sodom. Moses, again, verse 11, then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east because he's coming from where they were, Bethel, and Abram is going to go down to, it'll show us here in a moment, Hebron. He's going to come from Bethel down to Hebron, but Lot goes further south into the east toward Zoar and in that area. And they separated themselves one from the other. So now, after following Abram all these years from Ur of the Chaldees to Egypt, Lot departs from Abram, and his decision will eventually, he eventually pitches his tent towards Sodom. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent towards Sodom. It's a big mistake. Now, he didn't think it at the time that it was a big mistake, but the fact of the matter is that Father had told Abram to leave. And so the fact that they're in strife right now was partially because Abram had took him, and then Lot went with him in a couple of places, because Lot went with him from Egypt. Lot could have stayed in Egypt, but he didn't. There's something about, and here's the thing that we can learn from, there's a lesson. There is no indication whatsoever from what I read, but Lot was righteous. The Bible says Lot was a righteous man, but he pitched his tent towards Sodom. And Abram called on the name of YeHoVaH. I suspect because Lot came out of the same land as Abram, and they were idolaters, idol worshipers. Now, we don't know where Lot got his wife from, but I suspect that Lot's wife came down with him, because there's no indication that Lot found his wife in Haran, or he found it in Egypt, or he found it in Zoar. But we know Lot had a wife, and Lot ends up with 2 daughters. And Lot's wife seems to have a tendency to like. Here's one of the things that I found, which I think it can be problematic for a lot of our sisters, and that's vanity. There's a lot of vanity among women and even among men. If we were to be honest, there's a lot of vanity that goes on. Um, being connected to certain places and cities can heighten whatever vanity may already be there. Because it's not the place we're in that makes us vain. Vanity is in us, and if we don't deal with it, then it ensnares us. We can get connected to people, to places, and things. And it's those people, places, and things that gets into us that now connect to us, and as a result, tethers us to it. To be able to make that break is not always the easiest thing to do. And we find out from the very beginning that, Adam prophesies, for this cause shall a man leave his father and his mother and cleave unto his wife, and the two shall become one. There is embedded in the word times covenantally that we disconnect, but then also in covenant relationship with the Almighty that we have to disconnect. And Father made it clear when he brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. He says, listen, do not entangle yourself and then drive the inhabitants of the land out of the land, lest they become a thorn in your flesh and ensnare, a snare and a thorn. The society we live in can snare us. And how does it snare us? With things. It dangles stuff in front of us. And we have to know, we have to know how to have stuff without stuff having us. There's a difference. To have stuff but not be ensnared by the stuff. Because see, if you're ensnared by the stuff, somebody can take something from you and you're ready to take them out. You have a $800 phone, a $900, $1,000 phone somebody's stealing. It's the principle. It's the principle. And next thing you know, you done shot somebody over $1,000. Or somebody has done something terrible to somebody over something that has a monetary value, but the life of the person that you can't necessarily ascribe some kind of monetary value. These are the kinds of things that happen when we get tethered to stuff, when stuff has us. So Lot looks at this land, and all of a sudden, Lot goes away from the one who has kind of been the source of his blessing. And I would dare say that there are people who will connect to us because of that blessing. And you've heard me say there are people who want the stuff of Elohim, but not the Elohim of the stuff. They want you and your relationship with the Almighty, that's fine. And if I can benefit from you and your relationship with the Almighty, that's ideal. But I want the stuff the Almighty entrusts you with, but I'm not willing to make the commitment to the Almighty who entrusts you. People want the things of the Almighty, but not the Almighty of the things. And you have to be able to discern that. You have to be able to know these that labor among you? What is the motivation of why people are associating or connecting themselves with you? And once you know that, is whether good, bad, or indifference, at least you know what you're working with. And you know how to work with it. Otherwise, people can flatter you and say a lot of nice nothings to get out of you the things that they desire when they really don't have your best interest at heart in the first place, only what they can get out of you. And you have to be able to discern that, you see. And so now Lot is prosperous. He got stuff. All right, Abraham. Now, it seems, and here's the thing. Gosh. Lot see this is beautiful land. And he know Abram is the older, and he knows that Abram has prospered him. He's more than likely prospered. It seems as if what the humbling thing would be for Lot to do is you make the choice. You make the choice. But his eyes got the best of him. His decision suggested that he didn't care about anything but his herdsmen and his flock. He saw the plain, the well-watered, and he took what appeared to be the best part of this deal. Lot's decision to pitch his tent toward Sodom would cost him dearly. Verse 13. So Lot takes off. He pitched his tent toward Sodom, and the Bible teaches us, but the men of Sodom were wicked. Now, it didn't just say they were sinners. They were wicked, and that's like a double whammy. And then notice what it says, they were wicked and sinners before YeHoVaH exceedingly. They went beyond wicked and sinning. They were exceedingly wicked. And I can tell you something right now, brothers and sisters, because I'm looking at what's going on around the world, looking at the 2020 roster. I'm still not going to be pulled in, but it is important for me to see what I'm living among, to see what's going on. There is a possibility, brothers and sisters, for the first time in American history, there is a slight possibility that the President of the United States of America could be a married gay man. That's a real possibility. Now, people ain't talking about it, but it's a possibility. And the circumstances, not only in this nation, but because I look at the world news. I'm not just stuck on CNN or Fox or ABC. I look at the news of the world to see what the nations of the world are doing. And I'm going to tell you something, there's some synergy. There's some serious synergy about what you're seeing in various nations, because it's almost as if they're in the same playbook. And it's deeply disturbing. But it enables me to know how to pray and how to minister to people outside of the land in which we occupy, because Father, the Bible says, the earth is his, the fullness thereof, and all that dwell therein. And if we're going to be a people who take the commission serious to take the gospel of the kingdom to all the nations, it is imperative to understand what is going on in some of these nations. And it's sad to see, and to see that the nations of the world, the greatest, when you look at a gang, whether it be the gang of 8, the gang of 6, or whatever gang they are, Bloods, Crips, whatever, MS-13, there's always a leader. And the people follow the leader. Do you know that among nations, there is a leader? And who do you think is the leaders of the nation? The nation that leads the nation. The United States. You hear people say it's the greatest nation, it's the greatest country, and all of that. And there's a lot of truth to a lot of the things that people say. The world looks to the U.S. and begins to mimic what they see. That's what the world is doing. And everybody's closing their borders. You got xenophobic. You've got ethnic cleansing. You've got racism and prejudice on the rise. People want to get rid of all foreigners. I mean, you got a lot of stuff going on in the other nations of the world. And people say, well, that's always been going on. Yeah, it may have, and to some degree it has. But understand something, that when you have a nation who other nations are looking to for guidance and direction and emulation, then there is a standard. But how many of you know Father has called you to be a standard bearer? All of us have been called to be standard bearers because we are supposed to be ambassadors of the kingdom who are supposed to represent the King of Kings. And so you are a nation in the sense of being a light to the nations. And whether you take that serious, I certainly do for myself. You see, I know that with these cameras, with the internet, with social media, that we are a leader in ministry. Even with the little handful or small group or whatever, the reach of our ministry set a standard for other ministries. Now, if I didn't know that, I'd probably behave a little different. But I know this. And we should all know it because of who we represent and what we are to be presenting to the nations. We can't be quiet. We can't be silent. We can't be spectators. We have to take the lead, not wait on somebody to give us the lead, but we have to take the lead and be the light to the world, regardless to what other people do or don't do, we have to be the light of the world because we have been called to be the light of the world, and we're not to be hid under some bushel somewhere. He says, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before YeHoVaH exceedingly. After Lot separates from Abram, and YeHoVaH speaks to him again and shows him all the land that he is going to give to Abram and to his seed forever. Verse 14, Genesis 13. And YeHoVaH said unto Abram after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes and look from the place where thou art northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. Now, Father makes a promise. This promise is going to be expanded on in Genesis 15, but right now in Genesis 13, he says, this land which you see. And he says to him that lift up your eyes, look from the place where thou art north, south, east, and west. And he says, this land I've given to you and to thy seed. Now, here's why it's important for you to know your biblical identity. I'm not talking about the identity people want to put on you. But we have been given identity, and those of us who are in Messiah, we understand. If we don't, we should understand that our identity doesn't come from our skin color. Our identity doesn't come from our roots. Our identity doesn't come from where ships brought you from. Our identities is hid in Messiah. Period. Our identity is hid in Messiah. And what does that mean? Man is not going to be able to tell you who you are. Messiah will reveal to you who you are. And so I don't need to be reading people's books and watching people's videos to identify my identity, because my identity didn't start in Africa. My identity goes all the way back to the beginning. You see, just like the Almighty said to Jeremiah, I knew you before you were formed. Each one of us, before we were brought into the world, Father already had the plan for our lives before the world was formed, before the foundation of the earth. And just as Messiah was slain before the foundation of the earth. Now, like anybody else, in order for me to get here, unless there's some immaculate conception, and even if there's immaculate conception, there has to be a woman who came from somebody. So Adam, Mr. and Mrs. Adam was the first. And if you allow your roots to stop anywhere before you get to them, you've just hijacked your identity. Each and every one of our roots go all the way back to that. If we want to talk about a ship, we better talk about the ark. Because all of our identities go back to the ark with those three brothers, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and then to Noah, and then from Noah all the way back to Adam. So the only ship I'm concerned about really is the ark. But I know some folks are concerned about some other ships, and that's on them. However, when it comes down to what Father says to Abram, this is why, brothers and sisters, anybody who wants to stop their identity before this even can't enter into this promise, because he's going to say something to you, I give it, and to your seed forever. Now, some people want to claim the seed of Abram as Abram, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. You see that? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. See, the Messiah may have come through Judah, but the other tribes were equally important. Judah was no greater than Benjamin. May have been older, may have been the one chosen for the Messiah to come through, because he had to come through somebody, right? But if there'd been no Joseph, Judah would have been famitized. Is that a do with? Yeah. It died in the famine. You get it? Now, this seed, because this is important, YeHoVaH reveals to Abram and speak those things that are not as though they were. YeHoVaH speaks to Abram about giving his seed all the land he can see, and yet Abram has no seed at the time. He says, all this land I give to thee and to thy seed. What seed? There is no seed, and Abram know he got a woman who is barren. YeHoVaH promises Abraham that he will have so many descendants, it would be impossible to count. He says in verse 16, and I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth. Now imagine that. Now I was doing some blowing in my yard, concrete, all kinds of dust out there. And I'm looking at the dust, and the dust is like one big cloud. And you don't see separate particles. It seemed like all this dust, and there's probably millions of particles within the dust. And I'm thinking that in any time in Israel's history, when it comes down to the Jewish people, there's been tallies of where you can count the number of Jews. Even today, you can get an accurate count almost of, and this is why censuses are taken, in every city, in every state, in every nation, the ethnicity of the nation. A count, a head count, an accurate head count within a 2 or 3% of error margin of how many ethnic groups or people live within a certain geography. Now, what would make that impossible and in line with what Father is saying to Abram is that you would have to now consider that maybe he's not just talking about Jews here, because he said his seed. Now, I know Paul is going to say in one of his letters that when he was saying seed, he didn't mean seed. He mentioned seed, but that was a specific context, because the seed that would be the blessing would be Messiah. That seed is where the nations as a whole. But when we talk about land and giving the land to the seed of Abraham, I believe there's something to it. YeHoVaH is not simply talking about the offspring of Isaac and Jacob, but he's also talking about the offspring of Ishmael. He's talking about the sons of Hagar, and that includes Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, Shua, the sons of Keturah. So now, Abram is going to have Isaac, right? But before he have Isaac, he has Ishmael. He makes a covenant with Ishmael's mama, right? He gives Ishmael land. And then he says, when Sarai died, in Genesis chapter 25, Abram gets married again to Keturah, and she gives him these children. Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael, Genesis 16:15. Genesis 25:1. Then again Abram took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bare him Zimron, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua. In verse 17, he says, arise and walk through the land in the length of it, and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Now, if you look at the places that Abram went, the land that he walked from, because when he gets to Genesis 15:16, ultimately YeHoVaH promises Abram, in the same day, verse 18, chapter 15, YeHoVaH made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto your seed have I given this land. Notice what he says. From the river of Egypt. Now, Abram had been to Egypt. His feet went into Egypt. Unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Abram crossed over the river Euphrates when he came from Ur. So his feet is all up and down. If you notice, from Ur of the Chaldees, which is down by Iraq, Iran, and then Haran is up beyond Syria, still on the side of the Euphrates. So his feet have come from Ur all the way up to Haran, all the way down into Israel, all the way down into Egypt, and then back again. And so he says, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. And here you can see the promised land. Now, some people, if you notice this little gray spot right there by the promise, the P, that little gray spot, that's Israel. But YeHoVaH told Abram, you see the land of the red line by Egypt, that's the Nile River. And you see the red line over there by Iraq up to Syria, that's like following the Euphrates. And this is the promise. From the river of Egypt, the Nile, to the great river of Euphrates, this is the travel of Abram. And you'll see this, all of this land, which I believe Revelation speaks about when it talks about the temple being the breadth and the width and the height of it. Israel can't contain the temple, the whole land of Israel, the place where YeHoVaH dwelled, the city, New Jerusalem. New Jerusalem will encompass all of this land right here, all of it. Verse 18, and we're closing. Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto YeHoVaH. And that's the end of this teaching. So we got through all of those verses, 1 through 18. Shalom, saints. Tithing and giving first fruit offerings are critical parts of the believer's faith and has its foundation back in Genesis 4:4, when Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And YeHoVaH had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Abel was commended by YeHoVaH in Hebrews 11:4, where it states that by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. Solomon said in Proverbs 3:9 and 10, honor YeHoVaH with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall your barns be filled with plenty, and your presses shall burst out with new wine. The prophet Malachi wrote in chapter 3, verse 11 and 12, to bring ye all the tithe into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, says YeHoVaH of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there should not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, says YeHoVaH of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for you shall be a delightsome land, saith YeHoVaH of hosts. When we tithe and give offerings consistently in obedience to YeHoVaH's commandments, we can count on him to keep his promises to us and consistently meet all of our needs. It is our Father's desire to bless you. However, it begins with you and your act of obedience to tithe and give offerings. Do it today. Shalom.
For more information, visit www.arthurbaileyministries.com or call 888-899-1479. House of Israel International Services is made possible through financial contributions from brothers and sisters like you. Thank you.